Okay, so our final week of mini lectures and presentations on regions. Here we have Oceania, which includes Australia, New Zealand, and the Pacific. To take a closer look at Oceania, we can begin to see here the vast multitude of countries that are around the region, obviously with Australia and New Zealand being the biggest, but also of note is Papua New Guinea, which in this image, the western portion of the island is cut off, unfortunately. This, of course, is not sliced that way in real life. The line there, the north-south line, splits Papua New Guinea from the rest of the island belonging to Indonesia. We also see Hawaii included, which is interesting, spanning into the U.S., however, and other U.S. territories, Guam, um, America Samoa. So a number of different countries here included in this region. The Pacific Ocean is the key link that unites Oceania with as a region, which profoundly influences life even on dry land and acts as a biological and cultural barrier and bridge. We can see physical patterns such as the plants and animals found their way from island to island by floating, swimming, or flying. Humans long used the ocean to make contact with other peoples for visiting, trading, or raiding even. Wide expanses of water also serve as a barrier, limiting natural diffusion of plant and animal species, keeping Pacific Islanders spatially isolated from one another. And the ocean has imposed solitude and fostered self-sufficiency. Subsistence economies are among human occupants well into the modern era. Here we have a picture of the Kiribati village, where inhabitants are standing where their village used to be not underwater, and now it is, evidence of the coastline eroding as the sea level rises. On that note, we can take a look at the very important climatic and weather phenomena of El Nino, the patterns of shift circulating in circulation of air and water in the Pacific occurs irregularly every 2 to 7 years. It's not completely understood, but more and more so. Scientists have worked out a model for how these oscillations may occur. Its full name is the El Nino Southern Oscillation. So sometimes you see it written out as ENSO. And the opposite pattern in which normal conditions become unusually strong is La Nina. Can bring severe precipitation events, including tornadoes and blizzards, to places ranging from Indian Ocean to North America. So here we see El Nino graphed out with the air circulation loop, warm water layer, cold water layer, and then on the right, fully developed El Nino with reversed air circulation, warm water layer spanning eastward to closer to Peru, and cold water layer. This is how it was first observed in centuries and decades past by Peruvian fishers, with the warm water layer bringing in lots and lots more fish, and hence the name El Nino, corresponding to a gift from the child, most likely Jesus, in the eyes of these Peruvian fishermen. Global climatic change. Oceania, with the exception of Australia, is a minor contributor of greenhouse gases. Australia having one of the highest greenhouse gas emissions on a per capita basis. Despite negligible contributions of greenhouse gases made by the islands of the Pacific, they in Australia are highly vulnerable to the effects of global climate change. And as sea levels rise, the amount that they're forecasted to, many of the low-lying Pacific atolls, which are a landform created by a previous underwater volcano, will disappear underwater within 50 years, with only a 4-inch or 10-centimeter rise per decade, which is quite a significant rise, and especially considering that's what's forecasted. So other water-related vulnerabilities. Much of Oceania is particularly vulnerable to droughts and floods that can result from global climate change. Parts of Australia and some low, dry Pacific islands are already undergoing prolonged droughts. As fresh water becomes more scarce, virtual water becomes an issue. Virtual water is all the export-related activities, how they permanently consume or degrade fresh water in the extraction or production process. So we can think of virtually everything we use having a water footprint, whether from the way it was grown or processed or transported. And lastly, here on this slide, the warming of oceans can result in stronger tropical storms, threaten coral reefs and fisheries caused by global coral bleaching. Another important thing to keep in mind about the Southwest Pacific and the human impacts on the biosphere is that foreign-owned mining companies took advantage of poorly enforced or non-existent environmental laws. Major environmental damage has taken place over the past century in Oceania. Environmental degradation forced tens of thousands of indigenous subsistent cultivators into mining market towns. Horticulture skills of little use and needed cash to buy food and pay rent were common. And then the nuclear weapons testing by France and the US from the 40s to the 60s, the acceptance of nuclear waste from nuclear powers have become major environmental issues for these nations. Tourism impacts as well. Foreign-owned tourism enterprises accelerated the loss of wetlands and worsened beach erosion by clearing coastal vegetation for hotel construction, golf courses, waterfront-related entertainment. All of this takes an enormous impact onto the local ecosystems, especially considering currently with strained water resources for showering, laundering, other services that consume fresh water. Think of water slides, for instance. The oceanographer Charles Moore discovered massive floating island of plastic garbage in the North Pacific in 1997. We'll look more at this. This included plastic beverage bottles and caps, Lego blocks, trash bags, toothbrushes, footballs, and even kayaks. It's known as the Pacific Garbage Patch. And the peopling of Oceania, we can jump into more of a human geography lens here and consider 5,000 to 6,000 years ago. Even 1,000 years ago, linguistically related Austronesians settled Micronesia and Polynesia, sometimes mixing with Melanesian peoples. Polynesia here we can refer to as the numerous islands situated inside of the large irregular triangle formed by New Zealand, Hawaii, and Easter Island, which Easter Island is part of Peru, belongs to Peru. Or I'm sorry, excuse me, Chile. Evidence that ancient sailors could navigate over vast distances using seasonal winds, astrological calculations, birds, aquatic life. These are some of the phenomenal technologies that existed since, some would say over 10,000 years, or some would even say since time immemorial, since people have occupied these islands. Still finding more evidence of even earlier arrivals of peoples into this region. So here you see a great map of human patterns over time, the different corresponding cultural groups, some of which we were referring to in the previous slides. Some of this is a matter of nomenclature and how names get attached to certain areas through time, but very interesting to see the probable settlement routes between these islands, and Easter Island being off the map here would be further east. But certainly far ways off of Chile's coast. The arrival of Europeans drastically transformed this region, including Portuguese navigator Ferdinand Magellan landing in Guam and Micronesia. By the 1560s, Spanish set up a lucrative Pacific trade route between Manila and the Philippines. And the west coast of Mexico. Pacific not formally divided among colonial powers until the 19th century, and then more recently US, Germany, Japan, France, and Britain taking control of various island groups. So the colonization of Australia and New Zealand, most westernized parts of the region, are these two nations colonized by the British, resulting in quite strong parallels with North America. The American Revolution was the major impetus for settling, quote unquote, of Australia, because once the North American colonies were independent, Britain needed somewhere else to send the convicts. A steady flow of English and Irish convicts to Australia until 1868. Most chose to stay after their sentences were served. Go figure, with some of the better weather and climate in many of the parts of Australia and New Zealand. Although some of the areas where convicts were sent were quite far south, and very strenuous weather as well most of the year. New Zealand settled later, mid-1800s. Population rise primarily from British immigrants, but was never a penal colony. And the treatment of indigenous peoples, another sad part of the colonial era. And native peoples they still suffer from discrimination and maladies such as alcoholism, malnutrition, injustice. Very importantly, though, we can recognize how the Prime Minister of Australia officially apologized to Aboriginal people for the treatment they received since land was first colonized in 2008. Kevin Rudd. It's a very significant step, and one hopefully that more nations will undergo apologies. Oceania's shifting global relationships. After World War II, the U.S. became the dominant power in the Pacific, and U.S. investment became increasingly important to these economies. Australia and New Zealand joined the U.S. in the Cold War military alliance, even fought along the U.S. in Korea and Vietnam War. Since the 1960s, Australia's mineral exports sector is increasingly geared towards supplying raw materials towards Asian manufacturing industries. Huge amounts of mining taking place, especially in Western Australia. And many Pacific islands have significant Chinese, Japanese, Filipino, and Indian minorities. Small Asian minorities of Australia and New Zealand are increasing as well. To further that globalization thread there, we can look at this new Asian orientation, with Asia buying more than 76% of Australia's exports. 2011, China and India purchased major shares in Australia's coal deposits, not just output of the mines. So Asia buys 35% of New Zealand's exports, including meat, wool, dairy products. Asia increasingly a source of the region's imports as well. Think of all sorts of imports coming from Asia versus whether it be technology in terms of electronics, automobiles, and more so robots from Japan, and new Chinese solar technologies as well. And the Pacific Islands are further along in reorientation towards Asia than Australia and New Zealand, especially with coconuts, forest, and fish products sold to Asian markets. So here we see a neat map of the export trading partners across the region. You can pause this and take a closer look. You'll also be working with this map in your mapping assignment for this week. So to look at power and politics here, see how different political cultures, as far as democracy in Australia and New Zealand, parliamentary system based on universal suffrage, debate, majority rule. The Pacific way, based on traditional notions of power and problem solving, settling issues based on traditional culture of many Pacific Islanders, favors consensus and mutual understanding over open confrontation. There's respect for traditional leadership, usually patriarchal communities, leadership of family and villages, prefers that over free speech and other political freedoms. Developed in Fiji around the time of independence from the United Kingdom in 1970. That's a very interesting counter trend in the region. Urbanization, key theme to consider, especially in Australia here. Beautiful picture of Sydney. Shift from agriculture, resource-based economies towards service economies is a major driver of urbanization. Australia and New Zealand have the highest percentage of city dwellers outside of Europe. More than 82% of Australians live in cities along the east and southeast coast. 86% of New Zealanders live in urban areas. and to look at the ethnic roots re-examined. You can see a very interesting pie chart here of the various nationalities, cultural backgrounds, and the longings for Europe were accompanied by racist attitudes towards the indigenous peoples and Asians. Most histories of Australia were written in the early 20th century failed to mention Aborigines. Later writings described them as amoral. So Australia and New Zealand, to a degree, are still confronting this racist and unjust history and legacy. However, the social repositioning of indigenous peoples in these two countries is beginning to blossom. 2009, the Aboriginal population estimated at over 500,000. New Zealand, the number claiming the Maori background rose by 20% in the between 91 and 2009 to over 600,000. These increases due to changing identities, not a population boom, but more positive attitudes towards indigenous people, encouraged acknowledgement of Aborigine or Maori ancestry in the two countries. And society acknowledged discrimination as a main reason for low social standing and impoverished state of indigenous peoples. More respect for Aboriginal and Maori cultures has increased. You can see Aboriginal land claims flourishing as well. Aborigines thought to be too primitive to have a concept of land ownership because the nomadic cultures had no fixed abodes, fields, or flocks. Internal hierarchical differentiation was what the Australian High Court declared void in 1993, that this was no longer an acceptable position for a national government. And the Aboriginal Tent Assembly raised public awareness of injustices and remains a national symbol of Aboriginal civil rights. That's what this picture is illustrating there. And the court cases, efforts to restore Aboriginal, back up for a second, rights and land continue. And for the picture there, we have forging unity in Oceania, Melanesian, elsewhere in the Pacific, communication with wider world served by Pigden languages made up of words borrowed from several languages, and the inter-island travel in small planes from outlying islands to hubs such as Fiji, where jumbo jets can be boarded for Auckland, Melbourne, Honolulu, has increased the unity amongst the islands. Wide ocean spaces and great diversity of languages sometimes make communication difficult, but travel, sports, and festivals help bring people closer together. And the Pan-Oceania sports competitions are the single most common and resilient link among countries of the region. So the haka is an example of how indigenous culture in Oceania is being revived, celebrated, and incorporated into new places by those who wish to project a multicultural image. Highly emotional and physical dance traditionally performed by the Maori to motivate fellow warriors and intimidate opponents before entering battle. Here you can see the rugby team doing it before a game. So interesting cross-cultural transference. And that wraps up the mini lecture for this week. I look forward to your questions and our discussions below. Please post. Thanks.